The chain snapped taut against the post with a sound like a whip crack, and Bagrak Strongtusk did not flinch. She had not flinched when they dragged her through Kettleford's market square, had not flinched when the bounty hunter named Krail kicked her knees out from under her and forced her to the ground in front of the assembled crowd. And she would not flinch now, even as 30-odd humans stared at her with the particular species of hatred that came from fear dressed up as righteousness. She was chained at the wrist and the ankle, iron links looped around a hitching post thick enough to tether draft horses, and still she sat upright in the dirt. Still she met their eyes. One by one, when they looked at her, they looked away first. She was wearing the garb she had been captured in fitted warrior's leathers, deep dark brown, cut close to her body in the style of the Korghun Clan, with brass rivets along the shoulders and a laced front that pulled tight over her chest and left her powerful arms bare from the shoulder down. There were dried bloodstains on her left side from where Krail's man had caught her with a bolt before she went down, and her black hair, thick and coarse as horsehair rope, had come half loose from its warrior's knot and hung across her jaw. The left tusk at the corner of her lower lip had a small chip at the tip, old damage, old battle, and the right one curved upward and unmarked, ivory white, proudly displayed. She was, by any measure that anyone in Kettleford might have used, terrifying. She was also, by any measure that Jeremiah Morgan used as he came around the corner of the grain merchant's shed and stopped dead at the scene before him, the most striking thing he had ever seen in his life. He stood there for one full breath. He was a tall man, lean and dark from years in the mountain wind, with a tracker's quiet way of standing and a face that had more honesty in it than handsomeness. A strong jaw, a nose that had been broken once and healed slightly crooked, and eyes the color of river water over smooth stone, a kind of gray-green that caught the light at angles. He wore canvas trousers and a heavy coat the color of pine bark, and he had a bow across his back and a hunting knife at his hip, and he had come down from the Grey Vault Ridge after 6 weeks alone on the high trails because he needed salt and a real meal and maybe, if the road gods were generous, a full night's sleep in a real bed. He had not expected this. The bounty hunter Krail was standing on an upturned crate bellowing at the crowd. He was a barrel-chested man with a red beard and small eyes and a voice made to carry over noise. 300 coin, paid by the Iron Ledger on behalf of the Korghun Clan chieftain, War Chief Ulgrak himself, Krail shouted, and several people in the crowd murmured at the sum. She left the clan without release. She took clan property when she fled. She is wanted alive and whole, and I mean to collect her in 2 days' time when the Ledger's courier arrives. Bagrak said nothing. She was watching the crowd the way a caged wolf watches, not with despair, but with absolute, exhaustive attention. She was cataloging exits and weapons and distances, and Jeremiah, who had spent his entire adult life reading terrain and animal behavior, recognized the behavior immediately because he did it himself every time he entered an unknown space. "What did she do?" said a woman near Jeremiah. She was speaking to the man beside her, a miller from the look of his dusty coat. "Krail says she's an enforcer for the orcs, a clan killer," the miller muttered back. "Came down the Pilgrim Road 2 nights ago. They caught her at the Wayhouse at Brentmark." "She looks like she could pull a man apart," the woman said, with a mix of revulsion and something that wasn't entirely revulsion. "Probably could," said the miller. Jeremiah moved through the edge of the crowd. He kept his hands loose at his sides and his face neutral. He had spent enough time in enough bad situations to know that showing emotion in front of a crowd was how you ended up part of the crowd's problem. He worked his way to a position where he could see Bagrak clearly, and she happened to look up at exactly that moment. Their eyes met. She looked at him the way she had looked at everyone else, measuring, flat, assessing. He looked back at her, and he did something that none of the rest of the crowd had done. He held her gaze without contempt, without fear, and without the strange, prurient fascination that some of the others were wearing on their faces. He just looked at her. And then the corner of his mouth turned up, not a smirk, not a nervous deflection, but an honest, crooked, somewhat rueful smile, as if to say, "Well, this looks like a mess, doesn't it?" Bagrak Strongtusk, who had served 6 years as the Korghun clan's enforcer, who had broken up fights between warriors twice her weight, who had faced down a charging bull Tuskelk with nothing but a spear and her own nerve, who had never in her life hesitated when action was required of her hesitated. It lasted only half a breath. The crowd was noise and Krail was still bellowing numbers, and someone had started throwing market scraps at her from a safe distance. And still, she sat there with her eyes on the human hunter's face, and felt something entirely unfamiliar happen somewhere behind her sternum, as if something that had been locked had clicked very slightly and unexpectedly open. She looked away. She had to. She had never needed to look away from anything before, and the fact that she did now was infuriating. Jeremiah exhaled slowly through his nose. He turned to the man next to him. "The bounty," he said quietly. 300 coin when the courier arrives in 2 days. "That's what he said," the man confirmed, squinting at him. "You thinking of collecting it yourself?" "No," said Jeremiah. He was thinking of something else entirely, but he kept that to himself. He spent the rest of the afternoon in the weighhouse at the edge of Kettleford Square, eating salt pork and hard bread, and watching the comings and goings through the window with the patient attention of a man who is waiting for nightfall. The weighhouse keeper was a stout woman named Merritt, who had done business with mountain hunters long enough to know that the quiet ones were either the most harmless or the least, and there was no reliable way to tell. She kept one eye on Jeremiah and another on the window through which the chained orc was occasionally visible. "Krail's men are sleeping in shifts," Merritt told him, because she was the kind of woman who traded in information. "To awake at any time. He's not stupid." "He's stupid enough," Jeremiah said without looking away from his food. Merritt went away and came back with more bread. "She's one of Ulgrak's," she said, sitting down across from him uninvited. "Ulgrak's been sending bounty hunters after his own people for 2 seasons now. Anyone who breaks with the clan, he's not well, people say. He's frightened, and frightened chieftains do frightened things." "Why did she break with the clan?" Jeremiah asked. "Krail says she refused an order, that she had a line she wouldn't cross and she crossed into refusing it instead." Merritt shrugged. "I don't know the full truth of it. But an orc woman who'd rather take her chances on the pilgrim road alone than stay under a sick chieftain's thumb, I don't know. I've done similar for smaller reasons." Jeremiah looked at her then, and she had the feeling that the river-gray eyes saw more than they usually let on. He said, "If I asked you to leave the side door unlocked tonight, and if by morning the chain post in your square happened to be empty, and if 3 days from now Krail came asking questions, I'd tell him I slept like the dead," Merritt said calmly, and stood up and went back to her kitchen. The moon was a thin crescent, which was generous. Krail's 2 men were posted at either end of the hitching post, and they were talking to each other across the distance, which was careless. One was nodding. The other was yawning. Jeremiah moved along the shadow line of the grain shed with the same unhurried silence he used in the deep woods above the tree line, and he had the iron bolt cutter he'd borrowed from Merritt's tool shed in his left hand and his knife in his right. He did not need the knife. The first man went down quietly from a blow to the back of the skull, with the cutter's handle not dead, just unconscious, which Jeremiah had always preferred. And the second man turned at the sound of his partner falling, and Jeremiah was already moving, fast and low, and the second man sat down hard in the dirt with his head ringing and his vision gray at the edges. Bagrak heard it. She was awake, she had not slept. She had been waiting and watching because that was what she always did, and she heard the soft impact of falling bodies, and then the shadow came around the post and crouched beside her chain and put metal to metal and said very quietly, "Stay still." She looked at him. It was the hunter, the one with the rueful smile. "Who are you?" she said just as quietly in a voice that was a low, controlled thing, deeper than most women's voices, faintly accented. "Jeremiah Morgan, I'm a mountain tracker, hold still." The bolt cutter bit through the chain link at her ankle on the second attempt. The wrist chain required 3. She was on her feet before the last link parted, and he rocked back on his heels to give her room, which she noticed and which she filed away. "Why?" she said. He looked up at her. She had several inches on him in height, and her presence in the dark was something you felt rather than merely saw, and he said, "Because it's the right thing to do. Can you run?" She looked at him with an expression that could have cured salt. "Can I run?" she repeated flatly. "The bolt wound," he said. "Left side, you're favoring it." She was favoring it. She had been favoring it for 2 days, and she had not let it show once, and yet he had noticed it in however many minutes of observing her from across a crowded square. The irritation and the strange clicking open feeling happened at the same time, and she did not know what to do with either. "I can run," she said. They ran. The Pilgrim Road ran north and south out of Kettleford, and the mountain paths that Jeremiah knew branched off the northern section like rivers from a ridge. He took her off the road within the first half-mile, into the dark tree line of the lower slopes, moving without a lantern because he did not need one here, and she, it turned out, could see in darkness better than he could, which she demonstrated by catching his arm twice when he nearly walked into branches. He had a camp already made higher up, a tracker's camp, compact and hidden, with a low fire pit ringed in stones, and a lean-to of pine boughs, and a pack that held everything he owned in the world, organized with the obsessive efficiency of a man who had learned that being careless with what you carried could kill you. He built a small fire, the kind that gave heat without light from a distance, and he unpacked his kit. She sat on the opposite side of the fire and watched him with those dark amber eyes that had green in them when the light hit them right, and she said, "You risked your neck for a stranger." "I did," he agreed. "A stranger who might have eaten you," she added, and he recognized that she was testing the edge of the interaction, seeing how he would respond to the provocation. He considered the fire for a moment. "My grandmother ate people," he said gravely, and then let the silence run until she couldn't tell if he was serious, and then the corner of his mouth did that thing again. Bagrak made a sound in her throat. It might have been the beginning of a laugh, strangled before it could be. He had a small jar of wound salve and clean linen strips. He held them out across the fire without speaking. She looked at the kit, then at him, and the silence was long. "You are going to argue about whether you need help," he said. "No," she said, and took the kit. She unlaced the side of her leathers enough to assess the bolt wound. It had closed on its own but was red-edged and unhappy, and she treated it herself efficiently, without asking him to look away and without any kind of display. When she was done, she handed the kit back and relaced the leather. "My name is Bagrak Strongtusk," she said, as if the sharing of a name was a considered, deliberate act. "I know," he said. "Marit told me, the Wayhouse keeper. She helped you. She left the door unlocked." Bagrak looked at the fire. "Humans who help orcs usually want something," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a simple observation made from experience, delivered without particular heat. "Usually," he agreed. "What do you want?" He poured a cup of water from his water skin and held it out. She took it. He poured another for himself and said, "Safe passage north. I'm heading back up into the Grey Vault. I know those trails better than anyone alive. You need to get as far from Krail as possible before his courier arrives and he picks up the trail. The mountain paths are the long way, but Krail won't follow them because Krail doesn't know them and won't risk them. You go with me until you're clear, then you go wherever you're going." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "That's what I want." She studied him for a long moment. The fire popped. An owl called somewhere above them in the dark pines. "And if I refuse," she said, "then I put out the fire and sleep and head out alone at first light, and you do whatever you were going to do anyway," he said. "You're free. I didn't free you so you'd owe me." Another long silence. Bagrak looked at the fire. She had, over the course of the last 2 days, been constructing the framework of a survival plan, and the framework had several critical weaknesses, all of which related to her unfamiliarity with the human North Country and the Pilgrim Road's wayhouses, and the specific geography of the Grey Vault slopes. A guide who knew those mountains, who had moved through them alone for 6 weeks without incident, was exactly what the framework needed, and she was not so proud that she would reject useful assistance because it came in an unexpected form. She was also, and she did not examine this part of the decision very closely, not entirely displeased with the idea of more time in his company. "Fine," she said. "We travel together to the northern wayhouse at Ashford's Post. After that I'll know the country." "Ashford's Post it is," he said, and banked the fire and wrapped himself in his oilskin and went to sleep with the simple practicality of a man who had learned never to waste rest when it was available. Bagrak did not sleep for another hour. She watched the fire die down to coals, and she watched him sleep with his coat pulled up and his breath steady, and she thought about the smile. The specific quality of that smile. The absolute lack of fear in it, and the humor and the strange warmth, and the way it had hit her square in the center of her chest and made the whole world stop for half a heartbeat. She had never, in 28 years of living in a clan where strength was the currency of everything, met anyone who made the world stop. She did not know what to do with that. She went asleep. They were moving before dawn, when the sky was the color of cold ash, and the mountain above them was a dark shape against lighter dark. Jeremiah moved through the trees with the particular silence of long practice, and Bagrak moved differently. She was built for power, not stealth, but she was controlled, deliberate, and she learned the rhythm of his movement within the first quarter mile and matched it, and he noticed that too. The Pilgrim Road was below them, invisible behind the tree line. They were parallel to it, heading north on a game trail that Jeremiah followed by memory as much as sight. "Enforcer," he said after a while, not loud. Just a word placed in the air between them. "What does that mean for the Korghun Clan?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, "It means I kept order. When disputes between clan members became dangerous, I resolved them. When outsiders came into clan territory with hostile intent, I dealt with them." She paused. "When the chieftain gave orders that needed to be carried out and the person receiving the order required persuasion." "And the order you refused?" Another silence. Longer. "Ulgrak wanted a village burned," she said. "A village of humans on the clan's southern boundary. Farmers. They hadn't done anything. There was a rumor that they were sheltering spies from a rival clan, but I investigated and it was only a rumor. Ulgrak was not interested in my investigation. He gave the order." She walked in silence for a few paces. "I had burned things before for the clan, watchtowers, supply caches, enemy fortifications. I had never burned homes where people were sleeping." Her voice was level throughout, but there was something in it that he heard, an old, deep tiredness that had nothing to do with last night's exertion. "I told Ulgrak I would not do it. He told me to reconsider. I told him that I had considered it fully. He relieved me of my post and told me I was to be held and tried for insubordination, and I decided not to wait for the trial." "Good call," Jeremiah said. She looked at him sideways. "You have no qualms about an orc enforcer's history. You refuse to burn sleeping farmers," he said. "That's the relevant part." She walked. He walked. The sky was lightening to the east and a wind came off the higher slopes smelling of cold stone and pine resin. "What about you?" she said. "Mountain tracker. How does a man spend 6 weeks alone on the Grey Vault? Hunting, scouting trail conditions for the merchants who pay me to report on the northern passes, mapping game populations for the forestry wardens." He ducked a branch. "I like it up there." "Alone," she said. "Alone," he agreed. She thought about this. "You have no family." "No," she searched for the human word, "no people. My mother died when I was 12. My father ran off before that. I apprenticed to a tracker named Devith Crane until I was 18, and then he died of fever and I had his kit and his maps and I kept doing what he'd taught me." He said it simply, without performance, the way you describe facts. "I have friends in Kettleford, Merritt, a few others. I'm not unhappy." Bagrak absorbed this. In the clan, no one was ever truly alone. To be without clan was to be dead or next to it. The human way of living, this solitary, self-contained existence in the high mountains, was something she had observed from a distance but never understood from the inside. "You are not what I expected," she said. "You're not what I expected either," he said. "Though I'll admit I hadn't done much expecting. What did you think when you saw me in the square?" He was quiet for a moment, and she found she was listening for his answer with an intensity she did not entirely choose. He said, "I thought you were the most self-possessed person in that square, including Krail, including all 30 of those people watching, a beat. And I thought whoever had put you in those chains was going to regret it when you got out of them." Bagrak's jaw tightened. That clicking sensation again, deep in her chest. She looked straight ahead at the trail. "You were right," she said. "They will regret it." He smiled at the tree line. She didn't see it. He made sure of that. They made the first wayhouse shelter by mid-morning, a stone and timber structure maintained by the Road Warden Guild, stocked with firewood and a small cache of emergency rations, open to travelers. It was empty and they moved through it without stopping, taking only a bundle of candles and a small bag of dried oats, leaving coin on the shelf the way the wayhouse code required. It was the sort of small, automatic honesty that Bagrak noted and filed away without comment. By noon they were deep in the middle slopes, above the altitude where the cart tracks existed, moving on trails that were narrow enough that they walked single file. The mountains above them were gray and white, and the forests below were a dark green ocean. The wound in her side ached in the cold, but it was a manageable ache and she managed it. They ate moving dried meat from his pack, a handful of pine nuts that he found cached under a tree in a way that suggested he had put them there himself weeks ago. "You cache supplies," she said. "All along my regular routes," he said. "Takes a season to set up properly, but then you're never fully without." The clan does something similar, season caches in the border territories. She chewed her dried meat. "You think like a war band." "I think like a man who doesn't want to die on a mountain," he said. Same result. She made that strangled, almost laugh sound again, and this time a small, reluctant, real smile followed it, and she looked away from him before he could see the full extent of it, which meant she looked toward the valley and the smoke rising from what must be a farmstead far below, which gave her something to focus on. "If Krail picks up our trail," she said. "He won't, for 3 days at minimum. The mountain paths aren't on any map he'd have, and he's a road man. He'll follow the Pilgrim Road north and ask at wayhouses, and we won't have passed through any of them. 3 days. 3 days we're at Ashford's post. From there you can go east into the borderland territories, and Korghun Clan bounties don't run east." She nodded. 3 days on a mountain with a human hunter who freed her for no profit and cached pine nuts in trees and smiled at her like the world was quietly funny. She had survived worse situations. She thought this one, for reasons she did not fully examine, might be the most complicated. The second night was colder. Jeremiah made a fire in a natural rock hollow that cut the wind and reflected the heat, and they sat on opposite sides of it again. But the gap felt different, less like caution, more like two people who had not yet worked out the geometry of their proximity. He was cleaning his knife. She was doing the small maintenance tasks that warriors always had, checking her lace seams, pressing the salve into her wound, rebraiding the sections of her hair that had come loose. These were private things that she would not ordinarily do in front of anyone, but she was doing them in front of him, and she noticed she was doing them and she did not stop. "Tell me about the Korghun before Ulgrak," he said, not prying, genuinely curious. "Before Ulgrak it was his mother, Warchief Gorath," Bagrak said. "She was hard but fair. Under Gorath the clan had treaties with 4 human settlements on our borders. Trade. The settlements provided grains and metalwork. The clan provided protection from the bandit roads and access to the mountain passes." She looked at her hands. "It worked, not perfectly, there were always tensions, but it worked. And when Gorath died, Ulgrak was her son but not her mind. He saw the treaties as weakness. He saw every neighbor as a threat." She paused. "I stayed because I thought I could moderate him. I thought the enforcer role gave me enough standing to—" She stopped. "I was wrong. You stayed because you believed it was possible to do good inside a bad situation," he said. "That's not stupidity. That's loyalty." She looked at him across the fire, and this time she did not look away quickly enough, and he saw the full impact of what his words had done, which was to land precisely on the part of her that had been calling itself a fool since the moment she ran. "You are very strange," she said. "Mountain will do that to you," he said. She looked at him. He was bent over his knife again, running the whetstone in long, even strokes. His hands were competent, and there was a scar on his left forearm from something old, and his coat was worn thin at the elbows from years of the same rough use. He was not a grand man. He was not important. He had no clan, no people, no title, and his wealth was a pack and some cached pine nuts on a mountain trail. And he had looked at her in a square full of people who saw her as an animal, and he had smiled at her as if she was simply a person in a difficult situation, and she had hesitated, and she had not recovered yet, and she was beginning to suspect she was not going to. She made a decision. She got up from her side of the fire and sat down on his side, close enough that their shoulders were near to touching, and held her hands out to the warmth of the flames. He continued cleaning his knife. He did not comment on the change in distance. He did not tense or shift away. After a moment he said, "You should sleep first. Your side needs rest more than mine does." "Tell me one thing first," she said. "The smile in the square, what were you thinking?" He set the knife down on his knee and looked at the fire for a moment. "I was thinking that whoever chained you made a bad mistake," he said. "And I was thinking that you knew it too and were just waiting. And I was thinking that it was going to be very interesting to see what happened next." She was close enough to him that she could see the color of his eyes in the firelight, which was a kind of warm amber in this light, nothing like what she had seen in the square. She was aware of his shoulder near hers and the warmth of the fire and the smell of pine smoke and the profound quiet of the mountain. And she was also aware of something happening inside her that was moving faster than she was comfortable with. "Sleep," she said, to herself as much as to him, and lay down on the pine boughs he'd spread earlier, pulling her own oilskin around her, and looked at the rock ceiling above them, and listened to him settle on his side of the fire. She slept surprisingly well. On the third morning, things went wrong. They came over a ridge above the tree line, crossing a scree field in the open because it was faster and the view from the ridge would let Jeremiah read the terrain ahead, and they were halfway across the loose rock field when Bagrak stopped and put her hand on his arm. He stopped instantly. She was looking downslope into the upper tree line. "3," she said, almost soundless. "On the right, 2 on the left, waiting." He did not look. He trusted her sight and did the math. "Krail," he said. "He knew the mountains," she said, "or hired someone who did." "Hired someone, he's smart enough for that." His voice was calm. He was already reading the ridge line above them and the scree below and the tree line in both directions. "If we go back down the way we came, we walk into the 2 on the left. If we go forward, the 3 on the right cut us off at the ridge." "Up," he said. She looked where he was looking. The mountain above the scree was open rock, steep, no cover. But he was pointing to a specific feature, a rock spine that ran diagonally up and to the left, and she saw what he saw, which was that if they could reach the spine, it gave them high ground and a narrow approach that couldn't be flanked. "They'll have bows," she said. "So do I," he said. And then he put his hand on the back of her arm and said, "Run." They ran. The scree shifted and clattered under their feet, and the mountain sounds below changed. Shouts carrying up the open slope, and an arrow skipped off a rock 4 feet to Jeremiah's right, and he did not slow down. Bagrak reached the rock spine first because her legs were longer, and she turned and positioned herself like a wall between him and the slope below, because she was wider and had no bow and her body was the shield that made the most sense. And he ran past her and up the spine and turned and had an arrow knocked before she had finished the thought. He was fast. She had not fully appreciated how fast. He loosed one shot into the tree line below, not to hit anyone, to make them keep their heads down, and grabbed her wrist and pulled her up the spine with him, and then they were behind the rock proper and out of the direct line. 6 people, she said. Krail has 6 people total. He came up the northern approach with at least 4. That means 2 guards were left below. So the men we saw are most of his force. Jeremiah said, and she could hear him thinking, his voice doing that quiet, focused thing. He thinks the rock's spine is a dead end, she said. He looked at her. It's not a dead end. You know a way out. There's a chimney crack 50 yards up and to the east. Tight, but you can fit through it, and it comes out on the north face, which puts us above Ashford's post instead of below it. He paused. Tight means tight. How tight? He measured her shoulders with his eyes in that completely frank, assessing way. She was substantially broader than him across the shoulders. You'll have to go sideways and I'll have to push your pack through, he said. It'll be uncomfortable. Then it will be uncomfortable, she said. They moved along the spine, staying low, and Krail's men came up the scree behind them in full noise now, not bothering with subtlety. Jeremiah put 2 more arrows down the slope, still not to hit anyone, she noted again, which was interesting. And then they were at the chimney crack, a narrow vertical seam in the rock face like a split in old wood. He went first, turning sideways, moving through it in 10 seconds of controlled efficiency. Then he reached back through for her pack, and she pressed into the crack sideways, shoulders angled, and pushed through with the scrape of leather on stone and the sharp protest of her wound. And then she was out on the north face, and the wind hit her full in the face, cold and smelling of the high country, and Kettleford's valley was invisible below a bank of cloud. Behind them in the chimney crack, a voice, Krail's, close, furious, too wide to fit. Morgan, I know it's you, Morgan. You're interfering with a legal bounty contract. There'll be a warrant issued. Do you hear me? Jeremiah looked at Bagrak. She looked at him. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called back through the crack. Then issue the warrant, Krail. I'll be in the mountains. Good luck. He handed her her pack. She slung it on. He looked at her side and said, You're bleeding again. We'll stop at the first flat ground. She looked down. The wound had reopened in the climb, a small dark stain spreading at her left side. She pressed her hand to it. It's minor. I know, he said. We'll still stop. She looked at him. There was dirt on his jaw and his coat was torn at the left shoulder from the chimney rock, and he was calm, and he had just called a legal bounty hunter a fool through a rock crack while standing on a north-face cliff in the wind. Thank you, she said, which was not a thing she said easily or often. We're not at Ashford's post yet, he said. Thank me there. They made it to Ashford's post before dark. It was a wayhouse of more substance than the emergency shelters. A 2-story stone building with a stable and a well, run by a married couple named Ansel and Preth, who had operated on the Pilgrim Road long enough to be unsurprisable. Ansel took one look at Bagrak and said, Orc warrior, bounty trouble, coming off the mountain with Jeremiah Morgan, which means she's in the right, and showed them to a room without further comment. The room had 2 beds and a wash basin and a low burning hearth, and it was the first real room Bagrak had been in since before Krail took her at the Brentmark Wayhouse. She stood in the center of it for a moment, and something in her face shifted, something very small, before she controlled it again. Jeremiah saw it. He didn't comment. He set his pack down and unpacked the wound kit and set it on the small table, and Preth brought up hot water and a tray of food, and left without staring, which was also noted and appreciated. Let me look at it properly, he said. She sat on the edge of the bed and unlaced her left side, and he cleaned and dressed the wound with a steady, careful thoroughness, and his hands on her skin were warm and matter-of-fact, and entirely without the self-consciousness that most humans showed when touching an orc. And she sat still and let him, which was itself extraordinary, because Bagrak Strongtusk did not let people tend her wounds. She tended her own. You're better at this than I would expect from a tracker, she said. Devith made me learn it properly, he said. He said a man who couldn't treat his own injuries in the field was a man with a death wish. He tied off the bandage. There, that should hold better. She did not move. He was very close, having bent over her side to work, and he had not yet stepped back, and she was looking at the side of his face and he was looking at the bandage. And then he looked up and they were close enough that she could see the individual spokes of color in his gray-green eyes, and the moment balanced on a very fine edge. He stepped back, went to the wash basin, washed his hands. went to the food tray and handed her a bowl of stew and sat down on the other bed with his own and said, "East, you said. What's East?" She took the bowl. Let the moment settle. An allied clan, not Korghun, the Drevash clan in the border territories. I have a contact there, a woman named Sara. She was Korghun once and left a season before I did. She said there was a place for me with the Drevash. That's a good plan, he said. Yes, she said. She ate the stew. It was good stew. And you? Back into the grey vault. He was quiet for a moment. He had not, he realized, thought past getting her to Ashford's post. He had been thinking in operational segments, the way he always thought on the mountain, and beyond this segment he had not looked. He became aware, sitting in the warm room eating stew with her 3 feet away, that the idea of her going east and him going back north was a sensible, correct plan, and that he did not like it. He looked at his stew. He said, eventually, yes. She looked at him with her amber eyes, and before eventually, he met her gaze. He was a man who was careful with words, who had spent enough of his life in the mountains to know the weight of what you said aloud, because in the wilderness what you said was what you intended. He said, I could escort you to the Drevash border. She considered him. That is further from the grey vault than you've come. I know the country, he said. That is not a reason, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, I know, but it's the reason I'm giving. The silence lasted long enough to say something. She looked at her stew. Eat your supper, Jeremiah Morgan, she said, and he heard something in the way she said his full name that he thought he might think about for a very long time. They stayed at Ashford's post for 2 nights. Preth's cooking was good, and the beds were real, and the wound needed time. And Jeremiah spent the first day at the common table talking with Ansel about road conditions east, while Bagrak took a full day of proper rest, which she allowed herself because the wound demanded it, and because she was a pragmatist about the body's requirements. On the second day she was restless, and she found Jeremiah in the stable tending his supplies, restacking, reorganizing, adding to his pack some items Ansel stocked for travelers, and she sat on the stable rail and watched him work, and they talked. Not about clans or bounties or plans, about the mountain. About the specific and different ways they had both learned to read it. The animal signs and weather signs, and the geometry of high country drainage that told you where to find water in summer, and where the avalanche risk rose in winter. They talked for 2 hours, and she forgot, several times, that she was an orc enforcer in exile, and he was a human hunter she had known for 4 days, because they spoke to each other with the easy, equal fluency of 2 people who shared a fundamental understanding of the world, and were delighted to find someone else who had it. You track by compression, she said, looking at the way he read a boot print he'd found in the stable's dirt floor. You look at how the heel loads. And the toe, he said, the toe tells you pace, the heel tells you weight distribution and mood. Angry people land hard on the heel, afraid people lean forward on the ball. We track scent first, compression second, she said. Right, you have the sense for it, I have to compensate with other signals. He straightened. Between the 2 methods you'd never lose anything. She looked at him. Between the 2, she said carefully. He looked up. There it was again, that balance point, something tipping toward something else. He held her gaze and said, between the 2 of us, as a team. She got off the stable rail and stood in front of him in the thin winter sun coming through the stable door, and she was close enough that he had to tilt his head very slightly to hold her eyes because she had that height on him, and she said, What are you saying, Jeremiah Morgan? He said. I'm saying I don't want to turn around at the Drevash border. She was quiet. Then, you are a human, I am an orc. I am in exile with a bounty from a clan that is still led by a man who sees me as his property to retrieve. I know all of that, he said, and you are saying it anyway. Yes. She looked at him for a very long time. The stable smelled of hay and horses and cold morning air. Outside, a bird called. He waited. He was good at waiting. Years in the mountains had given him patience that other men found baffling, and he used it now, standing still under her gaze and giving her all the time she needed. She said, I have never met a human man who looked at me and saw. She stopped, started again. Who saw what you appear to see? "What do I appear to see?" he asked. "A person," she said, and the word was simple, and the weight of it was not simple at all. And he heard every year of her life that had led to that word carrying that specific gravity. He reached up deliberately, unhurriedly, giving her every opportunity to stop him, and touched her jaw with his knuckle, just the brush of it, the way you'd touch something you respected enormously and were not sure you had the right to touch. She went very still, not defensive still. She went still the way the mountain went still before a wind gathering. She put her hand over his. Her hand was twice the size of his, and the grip of it was extraordinary and warm, and she held his hand against her jaw and closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, and then she opened them and looked at him and said, "East, together." He smiled. That rueful, honest, warm smile that had started everything. She looked at it and felt it like sunlight on cold rock, and this time she let herself feel it. "Together," he said. They left Ashford's post the next morning. Ansel gave them a proper road traveler's provision bag, and Preth handed Bagrak a heavy wool traveling cloak at the door, gray-green, thick enough for mountain cold, and said, "You have good eyes. I saw you watching the ridge last night when the rest of us missed the weather sign. You'll do well on that road." Bagrak took the cloak and said, "Thank you," and meant it in full. The eastern pilgrim road was different from the northern one, less traveled, older, with shrines to road gods set at intervals carved from local stone, weathered and mossy, and attended occasionally by the wandering monks of the Way faith, who maintained them without much caring who was in the territory. The shrines gave the road its name, and the name gave the area its shape, a country of long distances and small, hard-worked settlements, and the kind of self-reliant people who did not ask too many questions about strangers because they had generally been strangers themselves once. They moved well together. This was not a thing that surprised Jeremiah. He had suspected they would, from watching her track and read terrain, but it satisfied something in him to have it confirmed. She took the left naturally, and he took the right, and they covered twice the observational ground. And when a group of 4 riders came around a bend at mid-afternoon on the first day of eastern travel, Bagrak was already moving to the road's shoulder, and Jeremiah was already reading the riders' posture for threat assessment. And they were reading the same information in parallel and arriving at the same conclusion: merchants, not bandits, heavy-laden, nervous, because the road had a reputation. Without needing to speak, the merchants gave Bagrak a very wide berth and tried to pretend they hadn't looked at her, and Jeremiah said safe roads to them as they passed, and one of them, a young man at the back, looked directly at Bagrak and said, surprised, "Are you your Bagrak Strongtusk?" And Bagrak looked at him with the flat amber eyes, and the young man went pale and spurred his horse. "You have a reputation," Jeremiah observed. "On the pilgrim road, yes," she said. The clan enforcer work was not quiet work. "Is that going to be a problem?" She thought about it. "I don't think that young man will run to anyone," she said. He looked more in awe than in alarm. "He did," Jeremiah agreed. He glanced at her. Was any of the reputation deserved? She thought about this with apparent honesty. "Some," she said. "The worst of what people said, no, but I have done hard things in my time. I do not pretend otherwise." "Good," he said. She looked at him. "Good. I'd rather know the full truth of you than a managed version," he said. She walked beside him in the long afternoon light with her cloak over her shoulders and her leathers dark in the cold, and she thought that she had spent 6 years carefully managing what people knew of her, and the idea of not having to do that, the pure, clean relief of it, was something she had not anticipated feeling. They camped the first night in the open, beside one of the road shrines, a waist-high pillar of carved stone with a road, God's face worn to a smooth suggestion. Jeremiah built the fire, and she prepared the food from the provision bag with a methodical competence that pleased him, and they ate and talked, and the conversation moved through territory that was getting progressively less guarded on both sides. She told him about growing up in the clan, the training that began before she could carry a proper weapon, the teacher she had loved, An old warrior woman named Grath who had looked like a boulder that had learned to walk and spoke in short, decisive sentences, and who had died in a clan skirmish when Bagrak was 16, and whose death had been the first grief of her adult life. She told him about the thing that made her good at the enforcer's work, which was that she was not afraid of anyone, and the corollary to that, which was that her fearlessness made it easy to de-escalate conflict, because people who were afraid of her calmed down quickly, and people who were not afraid of her were usually people she could reason with. He told her about Devith Crane, about the old tracker's absolute refusal to admit when he was tired or cold or wrong, and the way he would navigate by smell alone in fog, and always arrive somewhere useful, and the specific way he had of making camp in any weather that left you warm and dry in conditions that should have been miserable, and the last winter before the fever, when he had started teaching Jeremiah to chart the mountain passes in enough detail that someone else could follow the maps. As if he had already known he was getting ready to leave. "He sounds like he loved you," she said. Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. "I think so," he said, "in the way he had. Which was without ever saying it and by always making sure I had what I needed." "That is a good kind of love," she said. He looked at her across the fire. She was leaning with her back against the shrine pillar, and the firelight was playing orange and gold across her face and the white of her tusks, and she looked. He found himself searching for the right word in his own mind and arriving, helplessly, at magnificent. She was magnificent. Not in spite of what she was, not in the soft-edged, apologetic way that some people might qualify it, purely, cleanly magnificent. And looking at her was like looking at the mountain. It asked something of you just to hold the sight. He looked at the fire before she could catch him looking. She had caught him. She looked at the fire too, and the smile that came to her face then was private and small and nothing like the enforcer's flat expression. It was something new, a face she was only beginning to learn she had. The road deteriorated on the second day east. This was bandit country. The settlements were sparse and the road warden guild presence thin, and there were signs of recent trouble. A burned-out wagon at the road's edge. The ash old enough that whatever had happened here was not going to happen again today, but new enough to be a warning. Jeremiah read the wheel tracks around the site and said nothing for a while and then said, 4 horses, big crew. This was a planned hit, not opportunistic. The pilgrim road east of the shrine at Morrow's Cross is controlled by a man named Varath, Bagrak said. Was. When I traveled this road 18 months ago on clan business. She looked at the burned wagon. He may still operate here. What do you know about him? He has 15 to 20 men. Operates from a fortified farmstead east of the third shrine. He pays for information about travelers from the wayhouse keepers who are willing, which is why he knows who to target. She looked at Jeremiah. He will know a mountain tracker and an orc enforcer are on this road. Then we go around, he said. The detour cost them half a day and took them through a section of dense scrub oak on a barely visible animal track, and it was worth it. They came back to the road east of the area Bagrak had identified, and she was right. From an elevated position on the scrub oak hill, they could see, far below, the fortified farmstead she described, its walls and gates small in the distance, and the road in front of it suspiciously empty of the merchant traffic that should have been using it on a clear morning. "Waiting," she said. "Waiting," he agreed. She looked at the farmstead for a moment. 18 months ago I was on clan business and he let me through because Ulgrak's clan and Varath had an arrangement. That arrangement no longer applies. We're well past him now, Jeremiah said. He won't follow. They moved east. The sky was clear and the road improved again past the bandits' territory, and by mid-afternoon of the second day, they were approaching the wayhouse settlement of Crossgate, which was larger than anything they had passed, a proper village, 100 souls or more, with a market square and a wayhouse and a tanner's yard and a mill, and the smell of civilization rising in the cold air. They had not talked about what they were going to do when they hit civilization, not explicitly, Jeremiah was aware that the presence of an orc woman on the eastern pilgrim road in a human village of this size was going to generate a reaction, and the nature of the reaction was going to depend significantly on who saw them first and how they presented. "Stay close," he said, as they reached the village edge. "Not because you need protection," he added immediately. "Because I know how this kind of place reads strangers, and two people together read better than one person who looks isolated." She understood this. She fell into step beside him rather than behind, which was the right call, and they walked into Crossgate's market square as if they owned it and had been walking together for years. The square went quiet, not the rude, hostile quiet of Kettleford, a watchful quiet, assessing. A woman at a vegetable stall stared openly. Two men at the wayhouse door leaned together and spoke low. A child at the edge of the well pointed and was immediately yanked back by an adult hand. Jeremiah went to the wayhouse door. He held it open and Bagrak walked through, and he followed her in, and the door closed behind them. The wayhouse keeper at Crossgate was a bony man with suspicious eyes named Ferreth. He looked at Bagrak and said, "We don't take orcs." "She's with me," Jeremiah said. His voice was pleasant and flat. "I don't care who she's with," Ferreth said. "I said we don't. Your sign says wayhouse rates apply to all legal road travelers regardless of origin," Jeremiah said. He hadn't read the sign outside. He had read it at every wayhouse on every road for 20 years, and they all said the same thing because it was the Road Warden Guild standard, and the guild would pull a wayhouse's license for violating it. Road Warden Guild Code. I'll ask once more plainly. Can we have a room and a meal, or do I report this to the guild post at Ashford's? Ferreth's face did a complicated thing. Then he said grudgingly, "Meal only. No room." "That's fine," Jeremiah said. They sat at a corner table and the common room was aware of them, every person in it aware of them, and Bagrak sat with her back straight and her face composed and ate her meal without allowing any of it to touch her. Jeremiah ate beside her and talked to her about the route ahead as if they were the only two people in the room, and she let his calm be a kind of armor, not because she needed it to be, but because it was offered and she found she wanted to accept it. A man 3 tables over said, loudly enough to be heard, "Can't believe Ferreth's serving her in here." Jeremiah turned his head slowly and looked at the man. He said nothing, just looked. The man looked away first. Bagrak looked at Jeremiah's profile. He had not used anger. He had not threatened or postured. He had used only his attention, and the quality of his attention was such that it landed harder than either of those. She filed this away with everything else she had been filing. They were outside and back on the road before the trouble caught up to them. It came in the form of 6 men from the village, not trained fighters, working men, big enough and emboldened enough by numbers and by something they had apparently decided among themselves, and the one at the front was carrying a rope. This was the moment. This was what it had been building to. The 6 men spread across the road and the front one said, "Bounty Hunter Krail's notice went out on the eastern road this morning. 300 coin for the orc woman." Bagrak stopped. She had already assessed them. Farmers, strong but untrained, none with proper weapons, driven by the money and probably by a fear of orcs that they had dressed up as civic virtue. She could take 3 of them before the others reacted, and Jeremiah could likely take 2 more and the last man would probably run. She was calculating this because this was what she did and she could not turn it off. But she was also watching Jeremiah. He stepped forward. 1 step putting himself between her and the men, and he did it without theater or posturing. He simply moved, like it was a thing that had been decided long before this moment. He looked at the man with the rope and said, "Krail's bounty contract is for an active Korghun Clan enforcer. Bagrak Strongtusk is no longer an enforcer. She left the clan. She's a free person on a public road." "That's not for you to say," the rope man said. "The guild code says otherwise," Jeremiah said. "A bounty contract is invalidated if the status that generated it has changed. She was an enforcer. She isn't anymore." "Who are you, her man?" The rope man said it with contempt, and a couple of the others laughed the kind of laugh that comes from nerves. Jeremiah said yes and said nothing else, and the rope man's laugh died. Bagrak felt that word go through her like a shockwave. Yes. Not with hesitation, not with qualification, yes. 6 of you, Jeremiah said conversationally to the group, against 2 of us, one of whom is the best close-range fighter you will see in your lives and neither of whom has done anything to any of you. He looked at the rope. You know this is not the right thing to do. I think you know it. I think the man who talked you into this told you it would be simple, and now that you're standing here you can see that it is not. Silence on the road. Wind through the scrub. A long, breathing moment. The man on the far left of the group looked at the man next to him, who looked at the rope man, who looked at the rope in his own hand. The rope man said, "It's 300 coin." "It's not worth it," said the man on the far left, and turned around and walked back toward the village. 2 more followed, then a 4th. The rope man stood with 2 remaining men and the rope hanging from his hand. "Go home," Jeremiah said, not unkindly. The rope man looked at Bagrak with a mix of fear and something that might have been shame, and then he and his 2 remaining companions went. Bagrak and Jeremiah stood on the road and listened to them go. Then she exhaled through her nose, long and slow. "That," she said, "was well done. Could have gone the other way," he said, "but it didn't." She looked at him. "You stepped in front of me." "Yes. I did not need you to." "No," he agreed. "But I wanted to." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that she had not planned and that surprised her when it happened. She reached out and took his hand. His hand was warm and rough-palmed and significantly smaller than hers, and fit between her fingers like something that had always been there waiting. He looked down at their joined hands, and then looked up at her face with an expression of such unguarded, honest pleasure that it hit her directly in that place behind her sternum that had never been quite closed since the square in Kettleford. They walked on the eastern road, hand in hand, and neither of them spoke for a while, because what had just happened was better served by silence. They camped one more night on the road. 2 days remained to the Drevesh border territory, and this night the geography of the camp was different. They sat on the same side of the fire without discussion. She sat with her shoulder against his, and he sat with his shoulder against hers, and the fire burned between the road-shrined stones, and the sky above was full of stars, the hard, bright stars that only came out fully in cold, clear mountain country. She had been thinking about something all day. "Said it now. The man in the road called you my man." "I heard," he said, "and you said yes." "I said yes." Without hesitation, she said, and she heard the echo of her own history in that, she who had never hesitated, and the strange miracle of meeting someone who also did not. "I don't hedge about things that matter," he said. She turned to look at him. He was very close, shoulder to shoulder, only the angle of a head's turn between them. She said, "I have not done this before." "Done what?" he said, and his voice was careful and quiet. "Chosen," she said, "for myself. What I wanted, simply because I wanted it, without the clan's opinion and without strategy and without any reason except the wanting." He was looking at her, and the firelight was doing what it had done every night, turning his gray-green eyes amber, and his face was very serious and very kind, and she thought that whatever she had been made for in her long, hard life, it was not any of the things she had been made to do. It was this exact moment on this road with this man. She kissed him. She was direct about it, which was the only way she knew to be about anything. She leaned forward and kissed him, and there was a half-second of surprise from him, and then he was kissing her back, and his hand came up to the side of her face, and she felt his fingers in her hair and against the line of her jaw, and it was warm and real and absolutely nothing like anything she had expected anything to feel like. She had not known that you could feel known in a kiss, that a person's mouth could say, "I see you," with this much clarity. They separated slowly. His hand was still at her jaw. She put her hand over his, as she had in the stable at Ashford's Post, and held it there. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "I have been thinking about doing that since Kettleford," he said. "I know," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and she laughed too, and the sound of it went out into the mountain night, and the stars did not notice, and the fire did not care, and she felt lighter than she had felt in years. They sat together by the fire for a long time, close and warm, and talked and were quiet by turns. And when they slept, it was side by side with her back against his front and his arm over her waist. And he slept deeply and dreamlessly in the particular peace of a man who has arrived somewhere he had not known he was looking for. The fourth day of eastern travel was mild, the sky overcast and the road dry, and they moved with the ease of two people who had learned each other's rhythm completely, who could move in silence for hours without it being empty, who handed things to each other, water, food, observations about the terrain, with an unconscious domestic fluency that would have looked, to any observer, like something built over years. The Drevesh border territory was marked by a stone wall across the road, low and old, with a warden post and a gate. The gate was open, and the warden was a broad orc man in the Drevesh colors who straightened when he saw Bagrak approaching and said, with something in his voice that was very close to relief, "Strongtusk." "Garvith," she said, "I need to speak with Sara." "Sara's been watching the road for you for 2 weeks," the warden said. He looked at Jeremiah with frank curiosity. "He's with you." "He is," Bagrak said, and again the simplicity and the weight of it. Garvith looked at Jeremiah with the orc's direct, assessing gaze, and Jeremiah held it, and Garvith made a sound in his throat that was the Drevesh equivalent of a nod and opened the gate wider. "Come through, then." The Drevesh camp was set in a sheltered valley between two ridges, a proper semi-permanent settlement of high-end timber buildings with cook fires and the smell of tallow and leather, and somewhere the sound of hammering. It was organized and purposeful, and it was not Korghun, which meant it felt to Bagrak like breathing for the first time in a long time. Sara found them before they found her. She came across the camp at a pace that was technically dignified and practically a run, a lean orc woman with close-cropped hair and clever eyes and the look of someone who had survived a great deal through intelligence and stubbornness, and she stopped in front of Bagrak and looked her up and down with visible relief. "You idiot," she said. "I thought Krail had taken you back." "Krail tried," Bagrak said. "I had help." Sara looked at Jeremiah again. Her expression was calculating in the way that implied she was calculating several things simultaneously, including things that she found amusing. "The Drevesh warchief has agreed to offer you sanctuary," she told Bagrak. "Ulgrak cannot touch you here. His bounty has no standing in Drevesh territory, and the clan is prepared to say so loudly to anyone who comes asking." She paused. "But you should know Krail filed a formal notice with the Road Warden Guild, and the guild has passed it to every wayhouse from Kettleford to the eastern coast. You are a named person on the road. Travel will be difficult." Bagrak absorbed this. "For now," she said. "Ulgrak is not well. The clan will not follow a sick chieftain forever." "No," Sara agreed, "but for now." "For now I have sanctuary," Bagrak said. She looked at Jeremiah. He was taking in the camp with his tracker's eyes, methodical and interested, not uncomfortable. "And I have other things." Sara looked between them with the expression of a woman who understood everything and was exercising commendable restraint. "I'll get you both settled," she said. "Come." They spent 2 weeks in the Drevesh camp, and in those 2 weeks something solidified between Bagrak and Jeremiah that had been crystalline and beautiful in formation and became, in its fully settled form, something neither of them had words for, but both of them recognized as the most real and permanent thing either of them had experienced. He learned the Drevesh by watching and listening and asking careful, respectful questions, and the Drevesh reciprocated by watching him back with the honest, unsparing assessment of a people who valued competence and directness. The Drevesh warchief, a short, heavy-set woman named Brutka, who had the eyes of a politician and the hands of a soldier, asked him on the 3rd day to take 2 of her scouts into the mountain range above the camp and assess the northern approach, because the Drevesh had been having trouble with something using the high trail to raid their northern cache sites. He went. He came back 2 days later with a detailed assessment and the information that it was not bandits but a displaced pack of mountain boars, large ones, and he had identified 3 possible solutions and his recommendation among them. Brutka had listened and asked 3 sharp questions, and then said, in orcish-accented human speech, "Good, do it," and allocated him 2 of her people and the supplies he needed. Bagrak watched this from the camp, and felt something expand in her chest that she might, in another context, have called pride, except that pride for someone else was not a feeling she had frequently had to contend with. She spent her 2 weeks talking with Sara and beginning the conversations with the Drevash that would establish her formal position in the clan, not enforce her, because the Drevash did not have that role in the same form, but something adjacent, something advisory and practical and suited to her specific skills. These conversations were not fast, and they required patience, and patience was a thing she had but that she had rarely needed to apply to herself. On the 9th night, she and Jeremiah sat outside the small building they had been given. It had 2 rooms, and they had discovered almost immediately that 2 rooms were more than they needed, and she told him about the conversations with Brutka, and he listened with the complete attention that was one of his most particular qualities. "She's offering you a real position," he said. "Yes. It would take time to build, but yes." He was quiet. She looked at him in the dark because she could, and she said, "And you?" "Me," he said. "You cannot stay here indefinitely," she said. "You have work. You have roots. You have obligations to the merchants who pay you to survey the passes." "I have obligations to no one permanent," he said. "The merchant contracts are seasonal. I take them when I want them." He was quiet for a moment. "The Drevash camp is not on any map I have. The mountain above it is territory I don't know yet. The northern approach I just surveyed is the edge of some of the most interesting terrain I've seen in years." He looked at her. "There's work here if I wanted to do it here." "Jeremiah," she said. "Bagrak," he said, and the way he said her name was entirely different from how anyone had ever said it, not with fear or the tension of dealing with an enforcer, and not with the particular Drevash clan warmth that she appreciated but was still getting used to. He said it as if it was the word for something he had been looking for the whole time. She leaned forward and kissed him again, deliberately and without hesitation, and he wrapped his arms around her and held her with the absolute, uncomplicated conviction of a man who had arrived at his destination and knew it with certainty. In the Korghun Clan, when a warrior claimed a partner, there was a custom, the giving of a tusk mark. Not the tusk itself, nothing so dramatic, but a small, deliberate mark made by the tusks on the inside of the partner's wrist, pressure enough to leave a curved imprint that would fade by morning, but that meant, for the hours it was visible, that the warrior had chosen, that the choice was made and named and real. Bagrak had known the custom her whole life and had never performed it, had never wanted to, had never met anyone who made the wanting arise. She had been thinking about it for several days. On the 12th night she took his wrist in her hands and looked at him, and he looked back, and she said, "There is a thing in my culture, a claiming. I want to explain it before I ask." He listened while she explained. He did not look uncertain. When she was done, he turned his wrist up in her hands. She bowed her head and set the careful, deliberate curve of her tusk against the inside of his wrist just enough, and the mark she left was a pale crescent already fading, and she looked at it and then looked at him, and he looked at her with those warm gray-green eyes and said, "Is there a reciprocal?" "No," she said. "It's the warrior's act. The chosen one's part is only to receive it." "Then receive this," he said, and lifted his hand and set his mouth against her palm. And it was not the same thing, and it was not from the same tradition, but it was his, and it was genuine, and she held the hand that had done it for a long time. 3 weeks after they arrived at the Drevash camp, a courier came from the western pilgrim road. The courier was a young orc man in road dust and urgency, and he found Sara first, and Sara found Bagrak. The news was Olgrak. He had taken a fever in the early winter, and he was gone. The Korghun clan was in transition, a council of war leaders holding the seat until a successor could be determined by vote, and the acting council had, as their first substantive act, voided all outstanding bounty contracts issued in Olgrak's name. Bagrak sat very still when Sora told her. She was aware of a complicated feeling that she needed to sit with before she could describe it. It was not grief. She had not loved Olgrak, and he had nearly destroyed what she had spent years building. It was not triumph. It was something more like the feeling of a knot releasing that she had grown so accustomed to she had stopped noticing it was there. "The bounty is void," Sora said. "Yes," Bagrak said, "which means the road warden notice is void. Which means—" "I know what it means," Bagrak said. "It meant she could travel. It meant the pilgrim road was open. It meant she was not, as she had been for 3 weeks, a woman with a limited range of movement who had been making the best of her circumstances." She found Jeremiah in the stables, which was where he frequently was, because he had made himself useful there in the way he made himself useful everywhere, by observing what was needed and doing it without fanfare. She told him the news and watched him take it in. He said, "What do you want to do?" "Kettleford," she said. He blinked. "Kettleford." "Where it started," she said. "I want to go back, not to settle there, not permanently. But I want to walk into that square and be seen, not as a prisoner, not as someone's property to be retrieved." She held his gaze. "With you," he understood. He understood it completely, and the understanding was written clearly on his face. He said, "Then we go to Kettleford." They said their proper farewells to Sora and Brutka and the Drevash camp, and Sora embraced Bagrak with a fierceness that was its own kind of naming, and Brutka said to Jeremiah, "The offer of work in our territory stands. If you are ever looking for work, bring her when you come." "She'll be the one deciding where we go," Jeremiah said. Brutka looked at Bagrak with an expression that was very close to approval. "Good man," she said. The road back was a different road, not because the terrain had changed, but because they had, and because the way you move through a landscape when you are free and known and certain of what you are heading toward is fundamentally different from the way you move through it when you are running. They moved with ease and a kind of settled joy that is its own road music, talking constantly and being silent when silence suited them better, covering ground they had covered in fear with a different quality of attention. They passed the shrine where she had kissed him the first time. She touched the stone as they went by without saying anything. He saw her do it and said nothing either and smiled at the road ahead. They passed the Crossgate village, where the man with the rope had stood in their way. The village looked ordinary in the winter light. No one came out. No one made a gesture. A woman at a well watched them pass, and after a moment raised a hand in an uncertain greeting, and Bagrak raised her hand back. And that was all, and it was enough. They passed the burned wagon that had been Verath's work, or someone's work, and it was now frozen under a skim of early snow and looked like a piece of the landscape. They came down off the Pilgrim Road's northern branch into Kettleford's valley on a clear, cold morning when the sky was the kind of bright pale blue that only happens in deep winter, and the mountains behind them were white-capped and immense, and the valley was frosted and still and beautiful. The market square in Kettleford was smaller than Bagrak's memory of it. Smaller and less threatening and ordinary in the way that places always are when you return to them with the distance of time and the company of someone who knows your full story. There were merchants at their stalls. There were people going about the mid-morning work of a market day. There was the hitching post where she had been chained, and it looked exactly like a hitching post, holding a placid cart horse with a rope halter. They walked into the square side by side. The square noticed. Of course it noticed. Kettleford was a road town, and it noticed everything, and it noticed particularly things that had happened in its square before. The woman at the vegetable stall looked up and went very still. The miller from that first day saw them from across the square and stopped walking entirely. Someone said something to someone, and heads turned. And then Marit came out of the weigh-house. She stood in her doorway in her apron with her arms folded, and she looked at them. At Jeremiah with his worn coat and his bow across his back, and at Bagrak, tall and marked with the winter road, amber eyes and white tusks and the Drevash cloak and the Korghun leathers, and the absolute commanding presence of a woman who had walked a very long way and arrived exactly where she meant to. and Merritt's face did a complicated, warm thing, and she nodded once deeply, like a person acknowledging a thing well done. Then she went back inside and came back out with 2 cups of hot cider and walked across the square and held them out. Bagrak took the cup. The cider was hot and smelled of apple and spice, and she wrapped her hands around it and looked at Merritt. "How long have you been on the road?" Merritt asked. 4 weeks, Jeremiah said. "And the bounty business?" "Resolved," he said. Merritt looked at Bagrak. "And you? Are you settled?" Bagrak looked at Jeremiah. He was holding his cider cup in both hands and looking at her with that particular quality of attention, warm and unhurried and absolute, that was entirely his own. She thought about the Drevash camp and the shrine on the road and the chimney crack in the mountain and the hitching post behind her and his hand on her jaw in the stable at Ashford's post, and the tusk mark on his wrist that had long since faded but that she knew the shape of by feel. "Yes," she said, "I am settled." Around them, the market square continued its mourning. The miller went back to his walking. The woman at the vegetable stall went back to her vegetables, though she watched them sideways with a curiosity that was no longer hostile. A young boy came pelting across the square and skidded to a stop and stared up at Bagrak with round, absolutely fearless eyes and said, "You're really tall." And Bagrak looked down at him and said, "Yes," and he ran away as if this was the most exciting thing that had ever happened. Merritt said, "I have a room if you need it." "The same room," Jeremiah said. "The same room," Merritt said, dry as old wood. He looked at Bagrak, she looked at him. "Yes," she said, "we'll take it." Merritt walked them inside, and the common room was warm with the morning fire and the smell of bread baking, and the handful of travelers at the tables looked up and looked away. And one of them, a woman who had clearly been on the road for days and had no opinion about anything except her breakfast, gave Bagrak a brief, acknowledging nod that was one road traveler to another. Bagrak returned it. Merritt gave them their room key and left them at the bottom of the stairs. Jeremiah put his hand out and she took it, their fingers interlocking in the way that had become natural somewhere between Ashford's post and the Drevash border, and they went upstairs. The room was the same 2 beds, the wash basin, the low hearth. In the window the market square was visible and the hitching post and the pale blue winter sky above the mountains. Bagrak stood at the window for a moment and looked at it all, and she felt Jeremiah come to stand beside her, his shoulder against hers, warm and solid and absolutely, permanently present. "Kettleford," she said. "Kettleford," he agreed. "Not a bad place," she said, "to have started." "Not a bad place to come back to," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him in the good winter light, and she thought about the square outside and the hitching post and the chains, and the very first moment she had looked up and he had been there, smiling that rueful, unafraid smile, and the half-breath of hesitation that had come from somewhere she had not known existed in her. She had not hesitated since. She had decided and she had acted, and this was where action and decision had brought her to this room, to this man, to this feeling of being entirely and without reservation known. "Jeremiah Morgan," she said. "Bagrak Strongtusk," he said, the way he always said it, as if it was the word for something he had been looking for. She kissed him, and the square outside continued its ordinary day, and the mountains above were white and permanent, and the fire in the hearth put its warmth into the room, and outside in Kettleford's market square, something had quietly and irrevocably changed, not the buildings or the stalls or the hitching post, but the air of the place which had been, for one long terrible morning, the site of something wrong, and was now the site of a return, a triumph small in scale and enormous in meaning. Later, when the fire had burned to deep orange coals and the square below was quiet and the afternoon light was going golden on the mountain, Bagrak lay with her head tipped against Jeremiah's shoulder and his arm around her, and she said very quietly, "I used to think that leaving the clan meant losing everything. And now," he said into her hair, "now I think leaving the clan was how I found what I actually wanted," she said. He held her more closely. She felt him do it, the deliberate tightening of the arm, the shift that brought her in. She had been held before in the Drevash camp, in the cold camps on the mountain trail, but each time it still did something to her that she could not fully account for in practical terms, a kind of rightness that her body recognized before her mind did. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me," he said, with the simple directness he brought to everything that mattered. "I want you to know that, not as a speech, just as a fact." She sat up enough to look at his face. He was looking at the ceiling with the peaceable, settled expression of a man at rest. She looked at the scar on his nose and the gray-green eyes and the corner of his mouth where the smile lived when it was not actively deployed, and she thought that she had spent her entire life being afraid of nothing and being free of nobody, and that both of those things were true and would remain true, and that this, what she felt in this room, in this day, with this man was entirely compatible with both of them. That you could be strong and fearless and your own person, and still want someone so much that their absence from a room changed the quality of the air in it. She had not known that before. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me," she said back to him with the same directness because it was true and he deserved to hear it as plainly as he had said it. He smiled. That smile. The one from the square in Kettleford, the honest, rueful, warm one, the one that had done it, the one that had made the world stop for a half-breath and started everything. She had hesitated then, the one hesitation of her life, and she had spent the week since then in motion, catching up to what that hesitation had already known. She kissed the corner of his mouth where the smile lived. He turned to her. The afternoon went golden, and the mountains were enormous and white outside the window, and somewhere in Kettleford's Market Square, the hitching post stood empty in the winter sun, and the Pilgrim Road ran north and south and east in all directions like veins in a living thing. And on that road and in that world, two people had found each other in the most improbable way, and held on with the grip of people who know the value of what they have found. Merritt was in her kitchen when they came down that evening, and she heard them come in and called through the door, "Stew's on." And that was the whole of it, the acceptance, the welcome, the ordinary miracle of a meal waiting for two people who had earned their way to the table together. They sat at the corner table that had become, apparently, their table and ate Merritt's stew, which was good, and talked about what came next, not as a plan driven by urgency or survival, but as two people building something deliberate and real. Jeremiah would take a contract to survey the eastern passes in spring, which the Drevash and several merchant groups needed, and which would keep them in the territory Bagrak was coming to know. She would continue building her position with the Drevash, using Sora's network and her own skills, and in time, not today, not this month, but in the way of things that grow rather than being declared, she would have a name and a place in the eastern territories that was fully hers, not inherited, not assigned, built. Merritt came out and sat down across from them with her own bowl, which she did not normally do with guests, and looked at them both and said, "You know there will be talk." "About?" Jeremiah said. "About you too," she said. "About what you are to each other. This is a small town and it has opinions." "It had opinions last time we were here," Bagrak said. "It did," Merritt agreed. Bagrak looked at her calmly. "And what did those opinions accomplish?" Merritt thought about this for a moment. Then she smiled, which made her look considerably less severe. "Fair enough," she said, and ate her stew. Outside, the evening was coming down on Kettleford, and the stars were beginning to arrive in the deep cold sky, the same hard bright stars of the mountain country, and the road was quiet, and the pilgrim shrines on the eastern trail stood in their old, patient places, and the mountain above the valley was an enormous and permanent dark shape, and everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. Bagrak looked across the table at Jeremiah. He was talking to Merritt about road conditions, animated and specific, his hands moving slightly in the way they did when he was describing terrain, and he was alive in the way that people are alive when they are somewhere they belong, and he happened to look up and catch her watching, and he smiled. She did not hesitate. She smiled back, full and open and entirely her own, and it was, she thought, the most honest thing she had done in years, and it was easy. That was the thing in the end that she had not expected, How easy it was to be chosen. How easy it was to choose. Not effortless, nothing worth having was effortless, but right in the bone, with no resistance from the self, no friction from the inside. She had spent her life in a world that required her to be hard and certain and ready, and she was all of those things still and would remain so. And the love she had walked into on a mountain trail and a pilgrim road and a market square in winter was not a softening of any of those things. It was an addition. A room she had not known her house had, that she had found by accident and recognized immediately as the one she wanted to live in. Jeremiah Morgan, mountain tracker, no clan, no people, no grand title. A man with a broken-heeled nose and river-colored eyes and cached pine nuts in trees and a smile that could stop the world. Her man. She reached across the table and put her hand over his while he was mid-sentence, and he stopped talking and looked at her hand over his and looked up at her face, and the expression he wore in that moment was one she intended to put in her memory and keep there. Pure, uncomplicated happiness, the real kind, the kind that did not come from circumstance or position, but simply from one person being present with another person and both of them knowing, with total certainty, that this was where they were supposed to be. "I was going to say," he said, picking up his sentence exactly where it was and continuing it to Merritt, except that he turned his hand palm up under hers and held it. Merritt watched this with the expression of a woman who had seen a great many things in her wayhouse and was adding this one to the list of things she did not regret having witnessed. The fire in the wayhouse hearth burned warm against the winter, and the road outside was quiet, and somewhere above the valley the mountains were doing the ancient, indifferent work of being enormous. And in Kettleford's corner table, in the ordinary lamplight of a small road town, Bagrak Strongtusk held the hand of the man who had smiled at her when the world was against her, and she was not afraid of anything, and she was not alone, and she did not hesitate.